about John F. Kennedy and the Cold War. So the Kennedy administration faced some of the most dangerous confrontations with the Soviets in American history. And so this first clip I want to use just to illustrate, it's a clip from a movie called 13 Days, made about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this just illustrates what nuclear war could look like. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but they're basically drone space shuttles. They operate remotely. They go up into the orbit. They break apart, and the nuclear warheads drop down and can hit anywhere on the planet. So these are long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. So a country that has this power can destroy any place in the world from anywhere in the world. The Soviets had enough of these weapons to wipe out all major U.S. population centers within a half-hour radius. Like, within an hour, every U.S. city would be dead. And our only recourse was the fact that we could do the same to them. It was all we could do. We had enough of a window where we knew it was coming and we could respond in kind. So this is footage from a U-2 spy plane. Those are those, big fancy planes that can fly way up almost in outer space. They can fly above the radar. In October of 1962, a pilot of one of these planes flew over Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. They have cameras at the bottom. So his mission was to photograph potential missile silos in Cuba. These are some of the actual photographs. And so I wanted to pause on the photographs themselves. If you look at the top right of the frame there, those are missile silos. They contain nuclear warheads 90 miles off the coast. So you don't even have to have an intercontinental ballistic missile. Limited range missiles can be fired from these installations and can hit targets in the United States within an even shorter window. So that's the situation that we were in the 1960s. The Soviets launched the first artificial satellite into space with Sputnik. And the Soviets had the larger conventional military forces. And one of the chief concerns in the 1960 presidential election was that we were falling behind the Soviets. And so the two chief candidates in this election were John F. Kennedy, the Democratic candidate, facing Richard Nixon. Of course, most of what you know about Nixon is related to Watergate, and we'll talk about that later in the course. But for right now, all you need to know is that Richard Nixon is a foreign policy expert. Comparing him and Kennedy is not fair. Nixon knew far more about the situation than John F. Kennedy did. But here's the difference. The 1960 presidential election featured the very first televised public debates. And of course, in these televised public debates, candidates were watching and were being seen by all Americans. And Americans were not just hearing the responses or reading about the responses. They were watching these candidates answer questions. Now, Kennedy comes from a very wealthy family. Joseph Kennedy, invested wisely during the Great Depression, bought a huge number of stocks when they hit rock bottom, rode the Depression out, and became an absolutely powerful person. And of course, the Kennedy family has a legacy of power in the United States. So John F. Kennedy comes from wealth. And he had TV producers to coach him of how to appear on these televised debates. And so even though, if you watch the debates, Nixon crushed him, just absolutely crushed him. But it felt like Kennedy won because he was better looking, he smiled, he entertained the crowd, he told little jokes. He didn't know as much about the topics, but again, he played the cameras a lot better. Kennedy also made a clever stance when he associated himself with the civil rights movement. He went to visit Dr. Martin Luther King, who was in jail in Birmingham for registering African Americans to vote. And during his campaign, he went to visit and sit with Dr. King in jail. Again, associating himself with the civil rights movement. So what began with Truman and continued with Democratic candidates, now Kennedy is continuing that legacy. And so Kennedy won. It was still a close election. I mean, there were plenty of people who saw through facade and understood that Nixon maybe knew more about this. But Kennedy's campaign represented hope to a lot of people. He, again, associated himself with these important social causes. He had style to him. I mean, he had, his wife was one of the most beautiful women in the country. He was one of the most handsome candidates in American history. And that counts for something in a nationwide popularity contest. And so there's glamour to the White House and elegance. But yes, many people criticized this and said that the style lacks substance. But we're going to see him put to the test in a number of situations. He did pick some very capable people to be his advisors in his cabinet. His brother, Robert Kennedy, who would later run for president in 1968, was chosen as Attorney General. Robert McNamara was his Secretary of Defense. He's got a lot of very capable people here advising him.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
So, I love Kennedy's inaugural address, and I want to point out a few of the classic points from it. First off, of course, he says, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. But then he takes it a step further, and he says, my fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America can do for you, but what we together can do to make the world a better place. And he goes on to say, and what's the reward? It's a good conscience. It's the right thing to do, to seek to serve others, to help, to leave the world a better place. And in regards to, since foreign policy, of course, is one of the key issues in this campaign, then we've got to think about what can be done. If nuclear war is the extreme, and we obviously want to avoid that, but we still want to contain the threat of communism, how do we continue to be players on the world stage without resorting to nuclear weapons? Well, this is where he came up with his flexible response strategy. That we needed to be able to fight limited engagements. And so he increased defense spending in three key areas. Number one, strengthened our conventional forces. We need to be able to fight limited engagements in traditional ways without having to resort to intercontinental ballistic missiles. He also created a special new branch of the Army, the Green Berets, or the Special Forces. It was the purpose of the Green Berets from their origin to go to smaller places fighting against communist movements, to train these indigenous peoples to fight, to equip them, to arm them, and to function as military advisors around the world. And so this allows us to be engaged in hundreds of different countries in a very limited way. But then also, yes, under Kennedy's administration, we tripled the number of nuclear weapons that we possessed. And so let's not kid ourselves into thinking that this is going to avoid nuclear war forever. On to Cuba. Fidel Castro led a communist uprising in Cuba in the 1950s. And he went on to seize all U.S. properties there, to claim the lands of Cuba, to throw off the Platt Amendment. Remember the U.S.'s addendum to the Cuban Constitution after the Spanish-American War, that we maintained the right to purchase land, that Cuba could not ask any other country for assistance, and in response to Cuba's turn toward communism, we cut them off. We broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. We said no one can go to Cuba. No one should have business with Cuba. Americans stay away, period. Cubans left the country in exile. About 10% of their population came, and many of them landed and moved to Miami. So most of these came to the United States. And in fact, of these Cuban exiles, the Central Intelligence Agency began to work with these exiles in secret and to train them for a counter-invasion. It was meant to look like an internal civil war. The combatants were to be these Cuban exiles, and so it was supposed to be Cubans versus Cubans. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It went horribly wrong. Someone told Castro these people were coming. And it wasn't just Cuban exiles. In fact, it was American Special Forces operatives that also landed on the beaches of Cuba. And they were taken prisoner. And they were put on television for the world to see that now we have attacked Cuba. We have started a war.
Halt this offensive buildup.
Three people, a president, a revolutionary, and a reporter. For a moment, they seemed to hold the fate of the world in their hands. These three came together in the shadow of a terrible possibility. Cuba stood ready to become the flashpoint for World War III. Fidel Castro, Cuba's leader, was a symbol of everything the United States feared. American President John F. Kennedy publicly denounced Castro and plotted to topple him. But newly uncovered documents reveal that Kennedy and Castro were secretly reaching out to each other. And the catalyst was Lisa Howard, a pioneering journalist, all but forgotten today. Only now has this secret history been revealed, and Lisa Howard had begun to claim her legacy.
We will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
After winning the 1960 Democratic nomination, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy discovered that the American public was deeply concerned about Cuba.
ABC News saying good evening from New York, where the two major candidates for President of the United States are about to engage in their...
Kennedy used the Cuba issue to attack his opponent, Richard Nixon.
Castro is only the beginning of our difficulties throughout Latin America. The big struggle will be to prevent the influence of Castro spreading to other countries. Mexico, Panama, Brazil.
Kennedy's strategy worked. In January 1961, he assumed the presidency. In his inaugural address, he vowed to keep the Americans free of Soviet influence.
Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
But what the American public didn't know was that Kennedy had also inherited the outgoing president's solution to the problem of Cuba. In secret camps, the CIA was training Cuban exiles for an invasion of the island. Just a few months later, the invasion began. The landing at the Bay of Pigs was meant to be a surprise, but Castro knew it was coming. The CIA expected the Cubans to rise in support of their exiled liberators. Instead, they fought back the invasion. Castro personally directed the defense of the island. The United States refused to acknowledge involvement with the invasion publicly, a policy that left the invaders stranded.
The rebels did, of course, get in trouble on the beach. They were on the verge of being wiped out. There was U.S. naval aircraft within range of that beach. The chiefs and the CIA pleaded for the president to allow the use of that aircraft. And he said, no, I'm not going to initiate a war with Cuba.
The battle was soon over. 114 invaders were killed, and more than 1,000 were taken prisoner. When questioned, Kennedy could not admit what the press already knew: the United States' involvement with the invasion. He looked weak and confused.
Not to conceal responsibility because I'm the responsible officer of the government, but merely because and that is quite obvious, but merely because I do not believe that such a discussion would benefit us during the present difficult situation.
And so this brings up the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in response to the Bay of Pigs, Castro reached out to Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, and asked for aid and supplies and even weapons. And so the Soviet Union responded. And Khrushchev sent weapons, including nuclear missiles, to Cuba. And the president went public with this information. when that U-2 spy plane took those photographs showing those missile silos with the nuclear capacity to destroy the United States. And Kennedy went on television and warned the American people of a nuclear attack, and warned the Soviets that use of these nuclear weapons would trigger a war with the Soviet Union. And this is the closest we've ever come to a nuclear war. He imposed a blockade on the island of Cuba. The United States Navy surrounded the entire island. No ships were to get in, no ships were to get out. Any aircraft attempting to fly over would be shot down. Any ships or submarines attempting to break the blockade would be fired upon. And in this next scene, I want to show you how close we came to nuclear war. All right, so you saw how close that was. I mean, it's ridiculous. In fact, they later interviewed the captain of the Soviet sub, and he said he had very strict orders that if he were fired upon, to launch his nuclear warheads. So the sub did contain nuclear warheads, and they were to be used if those depth charges had been dropped. Now, Khrushchev was criticized for backing down. Kennedy was criticized for playing this way too close. However, we didn't find out until later, much later in fact, that both parties were in constant communication. In fact, there were deals being brokered behind closed doors. So Khrushchev removed the nuclear warheads from Cuba, removing the immediate threat of instant strikes on the United States. In exchange, we removed nuclear warheads from Turkey, which if you look at a map, Turkey shares a border with the Soviet Union. It would have given us first strike capabilities as well. So both sides were criticized. Thankfully, this is the closest we ever came to direct nuclear war. But obviously the Cold War is not over. Now let's go over to the city of Berlin. Berlin is controlled by 4 different parties. The Soviets controlled the East, and the West was controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France. West Berlin was thriving economically, while East Berlin was languishing. And many people were fleeing the eastern part of the city and going over to live in the West. Well, to complicate things further, the city of Berlin is within East Germany. And so it's surrounded by territories that are controlled directly by the Soviet Union. And the fact that people are leaving East Berlin was embarrassing to the Soviets. And so the Berlin Wall was built around the city of East Berlin, isolating the West and the East. Of course, this became a symbol of the enduring Cold War. And one of the very first actions at the end of the Cold War was the tearing down of this wall. And you can go to D.C. and you can actually see the wall today. It's in a museum. Now, Khrushchev and Kennedy were very aware of the potential danger of any hot-headed decisions. And the Cuban Missile Crisis emphasized the importance of communication between the two parties. And so a hotline, a direct telephone line of communication was established between the White House and the Kremlin. And also both parties agreed to a limited test ban treaty. And that means that neither side would test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Chapter 28, Section 2. It's called The New Frontier. And so we're talking about John F. Kennedy's role in the space race. And while, some of his ideas, he had an ambitious domestic spending program, kind of hearkening back to the New Deal. Some of those agendas were more controversial. But in particular, as we talk about the space race and many of his domestic goals, he accomplished a great deal in his short term as presidency. So First off, the New Frontier is what he called his policies, his domestic spending plans. But he also had to face up against a strong Republican Southern Democrat coalition. So the Republicans were obviously against him, but also Southern Democrats were beginning to turn against the Democratic Party and increasingly join to the Republican Party. And really, Kennedy's no Roosevelt here. While he's popular and his legacy has continued to make him famous, and of course the tragic story of his assassination and the glamour of his family there's a million documentaries about the Kennedy family. But let's be honest, he's no Roosevelt. He didn't win his election with an overwhelming landslide. It was a very close race. And so, we look at these things when presidents are trying to get their agendas passed. If it's a close race, that's what we call a lack of a clear mandate. Mandate means that you have the overwhelming support of the American people. And Kennedy just did not. And so it made it more difficult for him to get some of his goals accomplished. But here's a few things that he faced. First off, the U.S. was in a recession in 1960. That meant our unemployment rate was climbing back to recession level percentages. So we're not quite at a Great Depression. A recession is kind of where we were about 10 years ago, where unemployment was becoming a serious concern. The economy was not growing to the degree that it should. And so you've got a couple of classic responses for this. Kennedy's going with the kind of the liberal progressive response by pushing for deficit spending. That is borrowing money to stimulate growth. Roosevelt tried that, Truman did that, and so forth. But also, we are talking about the Cold War here. Part of his plan for stimulating the economy was to increase spending on defense. And so by boosting defense-related industries, this would also hopefully generate money to create jobs. Now, one of Kennedy's great passions was to help. That we could actually increase our prestige abroad by sending folks to help in developing nations. The Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress were not only philanthropic endeavors. In a way, they were meant to deter the spread of communism. So if you have a passion for helping people, particularly those in impoverished nations, you could consider one of these two programs. And, they're sponsored by the federal government. You go through a lengthy application process, and then you get to travel the world and help people and get paid to do it. Like any other government job, it's not going to make you rich, but it's a very rewarding career. And yes, it had a political purpose in stopping the spread of communism. Because if you can help these developing countries become sustainable without having to turn to, the emergency measures of communism, then you've done your part in the Cold War without having to hurt anyone. But of course, my favorite part of this lesson is the race to the moon. So the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man into space in April of 1961. And this was a major embarrassment to the United States. So the Soviets sent up the first satellite, Sputnik. The Soviets put the first person in space. Where are we going to get a win here? And, no one's fighting here. No one's dying, although the threat of the potential of an intercontinental ballistic missile also came with Sputnik. Okay, the threat of global espionage, the fact that we can send satellites over another country's airspace and there's very little they can do about it. Okay, those are military concerns. But there's also the scientific prestige that comes along with being the first group to the moon. And so Kennedy set the goal of landing on the moon before the end of the 1960s. Soon after the Soviets, we put a man into space. We also began to launch our own satellites. But in the summer of 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. And I have the privilege to show you the moon landing in just a moment. Now, as we start to think about the impact of this, it's incredible. You know, we've now landed humans on another planetary body. We have now put people into outer space. We have the capacity to look beyond our sphere, and even now to look beyond our galaxy. And that's, just from a layman's perspective, it's incredible. And so from this, university and scientific programs have arisen. Of course, new technologies like we've talked about. Whole new industries revolve around this. And so here it is, the first moon landing.
2, 1, 0. All engine running. Down 2.5, picking up some dust. 3 feet, 2.5 down. Take shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 6, 1.5. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the limb now. It's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind. I believe it, Charlie. It's raining, John. Okay, so would you, Charlie? You got all your steering and you're straight. Oh, this is going to be some kind of different ride. Hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale. Da 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 da. Hippity hopping along. 1 ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. We're burning flight. Roger. Looks good, flight. How's that make shot flight? Roger. Stand by for splashdown. Recovery America, stable water, cruise call.
Now, earlier we discussed a book from Michael Harrington, The Other America, pointing out that for many the Great Depression never ended. And it brought attention to poverty in our nation. And several, passions or hopes of Kennedy was to begin nationwide work on addressing poverty, on racial injustice, and on civil rights. Of course, there were several goals of his that were not accomplished, some that he did not live to see the end of, some that are just still ongoing goals for the Democratic Party. For example, Medicare for the elderly. Well, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, will sign into law Medicare in 1965. The rebuilding of blighted areas, that is, increased funding for urban renewal projects or low-income housing, and federal aid for education, also funded and signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson through the Secretary of Education Act. And as I'm sure you all are aware, on November 22nd of 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was on tour of Dallas, Texas, attending a parade hosted by the governor of the state, and allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald, from a book repository, which is a book warehouse. He was on the top floor, I think the 8th floor if I remember correctly, shot from 1,000 yards away at a moving target, which seems impossible, but he was a military-trained Marine sniper, and so he had the expertise to pull this off. Shot and hit President Kennedy in the back of the head from his moving convertible. Kennedy was taken to the hospital where he passed that night. Now, before Lee Harvey Oswald could face trial, he was actually shot point blank in public, moving from custody to the courthouse by a small-time mobster, Jack Ruby. Meanwhile, Lyndon Johnson succeeded JFK, was actually sworn into office aboard Air Force One. The Warren Commission studied this incident, and in the initial investigation concluded that Oswald acted alone. Now, again, they were never able to secure Oswald's testimony, though there was some time to interrogate him behind closed doors. A reinvestigation was conducted several years later, which actually found that Oswald was part of a conspiracy. And now, again, this is a matter of great interest. There's movies about this. There's books about this. Netflix came out with a show about this based on a Stephen King novel. Again, it's something that people have studied to a great deal. And so here you get, the survey version. But again, it's something worth looking into. And for one of your group projects, you might want to consider this. And so, while Kennedy's presidency was controversial, his assassination was a national tragedy. And he left many unfulfilled goals, like the national assault on poverty that Johnson will wage, or a national investigation on racial injustice in the South, or a national civil rights bill, which again Johnson will sign into law with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Or even tax cuts to stimulate economic growth. So Kennedy's presidency was short. He won election in 1960. He was murdered just a few years later. But yet his legacy is powerful. And he's left this kind of enduring legacy as an idealist, but one that a lot of people look to for hope. About chapter 28, section 3, and it's called The Great Society because this is Lyndon Johnson's great hope that the demand for reform would create a new awareness of social problems, especially on matters of civil rights and the effects of poverty in our country.
Lyndon Baines Johnson had a personality as big as his home state of Texas. As president, he faced challenges that were tougher than a bad batch of barbecue.
You are right.
In the tradition of FDR and JFK, Johnson was another three-initial president, and he was big on his initials. From Johnson's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, to his dog, Little Beagle Johnson, the White House was overflowing with LBJs. Unfortunately, the LBJ's move from the vice presidential quarters to the Big House came at a tragic time for America. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, leaving the country stunned and grieving. Sworn in as president just hours after Kennedy was shot, Johnson had big dreams for America.
In your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society.
Johnson's Great Society programs included help for the poor, funding for the arts, and environmental protection. He also signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, making it illegal in America to discriminate against someone based on his or her race or sex.
He grew up in an area where there was great poverty. He was a teacher, and he taught in a school largely made up of Mexican-American students. And he always kept that in mind, that it was more than just a racial issue. It was also an economic issue.
Lyndon Johnson was the best civil rights president of all time. He, in fact, said, I'm going to make Kennedy's issues my issues, and he, in fact, is responsible for the major civil rights laws that we got passed. He's the president who signed them.
For the civil rights movement, it was a Texas-sized step in the right direction.
Lyndon Johnson did lots of good things for people in the country, but he started escalating the Vietnam War and didn't explain it, wasn't fully candid about what was going on.
Until peace comes, or if it does not come, our course is clear. We will act as we must to help protect the independence of the valiant people of South Vietnam.
Johnson upheld the commitment Kennedy had made to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But more and more Americans were protesting the war. And by 1968, 30,000 Americans had died, along with hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, with no end in sight. So why did Johnson stay the course?
At the time, this country was deathly afraid of communism. And so most Americans, not just Lyndon Johnson, the president, thought it was a necessary thing to do. But had he been able to see the outcome, he wouldn't have done it.
By election time, all the good Johnson had done was overshadowed by the pain America had suffered over Vietnam. LBJ knew that a fight for re-election would likely be a losing battle.
Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
One of the things Lyndon Johnson taught not just me, but I think everyone, was something he said, which was this: when you're president of the United States, doing what's right is not hard. Knowing what the right thing to do is hard.
LBJ's initials might well have been LTL for larger than life. He definitely left a big impression on the presidency.
Lyndon Johnson was an amazing person in a number of ways. He grew up in a poor family. He worked his way through college as a janitor. He went on to become a teacher at a largely low-income school made up of primarily Mexican-American children. And his experiences as a young person shaped his passions as a politician. By 1955, he was the Senate Majority Leader for the Democratic Party. And he had a tenacious personality. They called him the Bulldog because he could pressure people into getting things done. He knew how to play the dirty game of politics. He had dirt on almost every single legislator, which enabled him to get those hundreds of laws passed when he was president. And when Kennedy was up for election in 1960, Johnson helped bring in a lot of those southern states that were on the fence because of the civil rights issues, because of his and Kennedy's passions for the civil rights cause. Now, when the war on poverty was unveiled, there were a lot of major pieces to this. First off was a tax cut, which would spur economic growth. The idea here is that it would increase investment into the private sector and that it would actually stimulate the tax revenue for the federal government and in turn lower the deficit. Another one of the key pieces of legislation by Lyndon Johnson was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We'll spend more time in chapter 29 talking about that. And his great passion was this war on poverty. And so part of this was the Economic Opportunity Act. Johnson believed that everyone, regardless of race, creed, national origin, socioeconomic status, deserved an equal opportunity in life, an equal opportunity to advance themselves. And this manifested through funding for education, for training, for small business loans. It resulted in the creation of the Job Corps, which is a job training program. We've got several here locally. There's a branch of it right here on our campus. Of Head Start, that is federally funded child care programs to give pre-K education to our youth. Because the reality is that pre-K education helps to prepare our young children for their education. Those who have it come in more prepared. Those who cannot afford it are sometimes struggling from the very beginning. And then community action programs like the WCCA that I talked about, which you can find. I think we've got one actually right here on campus, a WCCA child care program. You walk by it in the parking lot.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
A war against poverty was the war that Johnson really wanted to fight. In his first State of the Union address, he reached back to the populism of his father and grandfather. He took a Kennedy anti-poverty proposal and made it his own.
It will not be a short or easy struggle, but we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it.
When Lyndon Johnson became president, 35 million Americans were living below the poverty line in the most affluent country in the world.
And I said, but they don't vote. They don't have any organized lobbies. How in the world are you going to get any substantial legislation on poverty? Jack Kennedy couldn't. How are you going to do it? He leaned back and he said, and these words are engraved on my memory. He said, I don't know whether I'll pass a single law or get a single dollar appropriated, but before I'm through, no community in America is going to be able to ignore the poverty in its midst.
Johnson now turned to the director of the Peace Corps, Sergeant Shriver.
One Saturday morning, he called me up and said that his radio show, which he had every Saturday, was going to go on a couple of hours, and he wanted to announce on that show that I was going to be the new head of the War Against Poverty, or the head of the new War Against Poverty. I said, well, Mr. President, really, I haven't had a chance to speak to my wife. I haven't had a chance to talk to any people in my office. I don't know what they'll think about it in the Peace Corps. Couldn't you just postpone that? Frankly, I would rather talk to you about it next week. He said, well, now, Sergeant, he said, no, the truth is we've got to get on with that War Against Poverty. So please talk to Eunice now. Just talk to her now, and I'll call you back. So I put the phone down. I couldn't believe my ears. And next thing you know, the phone rang again. There was the president on it. He said, well, what did you decide? And I decided, I said, well, Mr. President, it would really be much better for me and my family if we could just talk about this next Monday or Tuesday and see what, I have a better idea of what you want me to do. And I'm afraid if you announce that I'm the head of the War of Poverty, people ask me what I'm going to do about it, and I don't know. And that will be a source of embarrassment to me and maybe not so good for you. He said, well, Sarge, he said, I have this radio program. It's going on about an hour. He said, let me call you back. So he called me back about 20 minutes later, and in a very low voice.
Of this, and I love showing that scene, talking about this man who's like suddenly put in charge of it, because you get a sense of the personality of this president. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson was sworn in by emergency on Air Force One right after the president was assassinated. but he won an actual election in 1964. His opponent was the Republican Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater wanted to postpone these social spending programs and wanted to focus on the war in Vietnam. In fact, his plan was to begin bombing Vietnam automatically, which really made it a simple decision for a lot of Americans. LBJ won in a landslide. And so meanwhile, Southern Democrats were continuing to turn against the Democratic Party. Partly because of the Democrats' focus on social spending, but mostly on the civil rights issue. But even still, the Democrats here had the necessary majority to win the presidency. And so the Great Society was announced. This is Lyndon Johnson's legislation to end poverty. As you can imagine, a very ambitious, maybe even idealistic goal. Johnson was able to get Congress to pass 206 different laws related to this. And let's unpack some of these. For one, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act funded materials for public schools, in particular, opened up public high schools around the country. In regards to health care, Lyndon Johnson was the one who signed Medicare into law, which provides low-cost medical and hospital insurance for senior citizens. He was the one who signed Medicaid into law, which provides health insurance for those who cannot afford it. So, if your family cannot afford health care and it's provided for you, this is the man who made that possible.
It's a confidential sounding voice. He said, now listen, he said, I'm going to announce you, and I can't speak about it loud because I have the whole cabinet here in the office. But you just have to understand, Sergeant, this is your president speaking, and I'm going to announce you as the head of the War Against Poverty. Boom.
So help me God.
I turned to my wife and I said, looks as if I'm going to be the new head of the War Against Poverty.
President Johnson's program on poverty is distinguished in at least 4 ways. First of all, it is
in 6 short weeks, Johnson had come up with his package, but he would let Shriver worry about the details.
He didn't have to tell me what he desired. I knew what he desired. He wanted to get going big, and he wanted to get going with success. He didn't have to tell me that.
Johnson crisscrossed the country, appealing for support for his anti-poverty legislation. Poverty in America had been invisible. Johnson put it on the front pages.
Our first objective is to free 30 million Americans from the prison of poverty. Can you help us free these Americans? And if you can, let me hear your voices.
For Johnson, it was a return to his political past. The old battle cries of the New Deal coming alive again.
He was the last soldier in the New Deal war, like the final expression of everything which had gone on in the 30s and 40s. Government as mother, father, smothering Lyndon Johnson, big arms around you, I love you, I want you to do better.
Do something we can be proud of. Help the weak and the meek and lift them up and help them train and give them an education where they can make their own way instead of having to live off the bounty of our generosity.
Most people don't actively care about people they don't know, people who are suffering. It's hard for us to remember those people. Lyndon never really forgot them, I think. I really think he never did.
His vision was of helping the disadvantaged to help themselves. His hope was that you give them education, you give them opportunity, you give them the chance to come into the mainstream of American middle-class economic life. And that's as thoroughly American as apple pie.
We have a right to expect a job, to provide food for our families, a roof over their head, clothes for their body, and with your help, and with God's help, we will have it in America. Thank you.
Johnson would make war on poverty, and there would be no casualties. Everyone would be a winner, even big business.
He would tell business people, listen, we've got a very abundant country.
All right, so we've talked about education, we've talked about health care. What about housing? You know, one of the basic needs of America's poor is for a safe and warm and comfortable place to sleep with their families. And so there were laws passed that, shifted money for public housing to low and moderate income areas. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was created under one of these laws with the War on Poverty. And also, regarding immigration, when the Bracero program came to an end in the Second World War, there was this really difficult time for a lot of migrant families in our country where they had been encouraged to come into the country, and now they found themselves in a climate where they were not wanted, where they were looked down upon, where they were treated as second class, and where much of what you read in the Grapes of Wrath came true for these families. And Johnson's plan to put an end to this was the Immigration Act of 1965, which put an end to quotas based on where people were coming from. Yes, there were quotas. X amount of people allowed from this country, X amount from this country, X amount from this country. Depending on your race, you may come in, or your race, you may not come in. And that's just wrong. It's discrimination. And so the Immigration Act of 1965 was created to put an end to that. But also in regards to the environment. Rachel Carson wrote a book, and I've got a copy if you want to borrow it, called Silent Spring, exposing the dangers of pesticides in our country. We drink filtered water. Go to the water fountain. That's filtered water. Cows do not. They drink from streams, from ponds. They are exposed to dangerous diseases and pesticides. We eat those cows. Indirectly, you consume those pesticides and those very same diseases that those animals are drinking. Same with produce, same with fruit. And so the Water Quality Act of 1965 was created, requiring states to clean up their rivers. The Pigeon River, just 1 hour from here, past Asheville, was once considered a dead ecosystem, unsafe even to wade into. It was so heavily polluted from the Blue Ridge Paper Company, then called Champion Paper Company in Canton. So polluted that you couldn't even wade in the water. You still shouldn't drink the water, obviously, but thanks to the Water Quality Act of 1965, as well as a collection of lawsuits based on this federal law requiring the paper company to clean up the river, fish are beginning to return. You can now safely swim in this river. Also, in regards to consumer protection, laws were set requiring labels on consumer products, requiring safer cars, safer food by federal law.
We've got the resources to help these people who are right at the bottom. For God's sakes, don't you understand that your interest, in effect he was arguing, your interest as a business leader is the welfare state because you keep everything stable? It must have been a very appealing argument to a corporate executive who was not to the right of Attila the Hun, that in a civilized country with such abundance as we have, astounding abundance compared to the rest of the world, you can afford to be liberal with the poor.
We were a generation of people who had been in World War II. So when a war against poverty was launched, it was typical of all of us at that time to think of this war, the war against poverty, in terms just like the war against Hitler. We were accustomed to thinking in terms of the United States being able to do big things. America bestrode the world like a colossus. There was nothing in the world equal to the United States of America.
The war on poverty was just part of Johnson's program for the country. Few anticipated that this coarse and abrasive Texan would propose a series of laws to enrich daily life for all Americans. He called his vision the Great Society.
The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where leisure is a welcome chance to build and reflect, not a feared cause of boredom and restlessness. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community.
It was an inflated rhetoric,
It is a place where man can renew
the
contact.
kind American leaders seldom use anymore.
It is a place which honors creation for its own sake.
As one aide described it, what he meant was a full stomach, yes, but a fuller life, too.
It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their gold than the quantity of their goods.
His aspirations were enormous. He wanted to do something for everyone. He wanted to be the best father Americans ever had. But in 1964, Johnson still thought of himself as standing in John Kennedy's shadow. He hated that he was merely an accidental president. He wanted to be elected president in his own right. The Republican Party was going to make it easy.
Now, when you have a string of Democratic presidents, that of course means Supreme Court appointments, and you know, it can shift the political spectrum of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren definitely moved the court to the left quite a bit. They ruled that the loyalty oaths under the McCarthy era were unconstitutional. Numerous cases affirming free speech and the separation of church and state. In addition to rules that reformed the way in which states redrew congressional districts. In fact, the federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court has currently ruled that the state of North Carolina is drawing its congressional districts in an unconstitutional way. And by the order of the United States Supreme Court, North Carolina is having to come up with a different plan. And so these court rules require that districts are equally proportioned. And while these rulings were passed in the 1960s, what practice has shown, what history has shown, is that we still have problems with this. And so some of these landmark cases, and I believe they're listed on the second part of your notes there. Brown versus Board of Education ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. We'll spend a lot more time on this one in Chapter 29, but I just wanted to point out that this landmark case was passed during Lyndon Johnson's. Well, it was passed in 1953, so it predated Johnson, but it was passed as a result of this Chief Justice Earl Warren. Secondly, Baker v. Carr established the principle of one person, one vote, and it asserted that federal courts had the right to tell states to reapportion districts for more equal representation, which, based on this precedent, the state of North Carolina, again, has been ordered by the United States Supreme Court to reapportion its districts in a more equitable way. And we'll talk about that more in civics economics, but just for example, the district that we live in was drawn to exclude Asheville, even though it's right next to us. And the purposes of that were to benefit a particular political party. And that's just one example of gerrymandering, of unfair drawing of congressional districts. And then finally, Mapp v. Ohio ruled that evidence seized illegally could not be used in state courts. This is also known as the exclusionary rule. So no longer can an officer allege that you have contraband if you were searched in an unconstitutional way. So no longer can an officer of the law say, you look sketchy, I'm going to search you. No, they have to prove to a judge to demonstrate probable cause and then get a warrant to search your personal property. The next three cases are also huge in regard to your personal rights. Gideon v. Wainwright required that criminal courts provide legal counsel to those who cannot afford it. You are entitled to representation. Even if you cannot afford it, it will be provided to you by the state. officers are required to read that to you. Because of another case, Miranda v. Arizona. You must be informed of your rights if you are placed under arrest. If you are not, then due process has not been followed and you will get out on a technicality. And then finally, Escobedo v. Illinois. If you are questioned by an officer of the law, you have a right to have an attorney present. And if you cannot afford said attorney, you have a right for one to be provided to you by the state of North Carolina. Even if they ask you, hi, how you doing? I'll need a lawyer present. Well, that'd be rude. But if you feel uncomfortable answering a question to an officer, all you have to say is, I would like a lawyer present. And whether you can afford one or not is beside the point. They have to stop asking you questions at that moment. Again, by order of the U.S. Supreme Court. So the social and economic effects of this. The rate of poverty did drop in a measurable way. These tax cuts did spur the economy. The Great Society programs did cost an awful lot, which does raise an important debate over the effectiveness of programs like this, over whether or not the government should be involved in this type of role. Okay,